Imagine being born and never leaving your bed, never feeling grass under your feet, never seeing the world beyond four white walls. This was the reality for one child in 1889 Boston, a boy whose entire existence became a medical experiment forgotten by history until now. His name was Thomas Whitman, and he lived his entire 23 years inside Ward 7 of Boston City Hospital. What started as temporary care became a lifetime prison sentence, one that would reveal the darkest corners of American medical ethics. The year was 1889. Boston's industrial boom had created a city of extremes, grand mansions on Beacon Hill, while immigrants crowded into disease-ridden tenements below. In this divided world, Boston City Hospital stood as a beacon of modern medicine, its red brick walls promising healing to the masses. But behind those walls, something terrible was happening. It began on a freezing February night when a woman collapsed outside the hospital's emergency entrance. She was dying, her body ravaged by tuberculosis and malnutrition. In her arms, she clutched a baby boy, no more than 6 months old. His legs were twisted at impossible angles, his spine curved like a question mark. The woman whispered a single name, Thomas, before drawing her last breath. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the hospital's chief orthopedic surgeon, examined the child. Thomas suffered from severe spina bifida, a condition that had left his lower body completely paralyzed. His spine was so malformed that sitting upright was impossible. In 1889, children like Thomas rarely survived past their first birthday. But Thomas was different. Despite his broken body, his eyes burned with intelligence. His mind was sharp, hungry for knowledge. Dr. Harrison Blackwood made a decision that would haunt the hospital for decades. Thomas would become his lifelong patient. What followed was not kindness, but something far more sinister. Dr. Blackwood saw opportunity in Thomas's condition, a chance to study the progression of spinal deformities and a living subject. The boy would never walk, never leave his bed, never experience normal human contact. He was the perfect specimen for long-term observation. Thomas was moved to Ward 7, a section of the hospital reserved for chronic cases. Unlike other wards, Ward 7 had no windows facing the street. Its occupants were forgotten people, those deemed too damaged or too dangerous for society. Here, Thomas began his life sentence. The hospital's records, discovered in 1987 during a renovation, paint a disturbing picture. Dr. Blackwood documented every aspect of Thomas's physical development with scientific precision. Weekly measurements of his spinal curvature, detailed sketches of his deteriorating muscle mass, photographs of his increasingly gaunt face. But what the records don't show is the human cost. Nurses who worked Ward 7 in the 1890s left behind letters and diary entries that tell a different story. Mary Catherine O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who worked the night shift, wrote to her sister in Cork, "There's a boy here who breaks my heart. He reads everything I bring him, newspapers, books, even medical journals. His mind is trapped in a body that betrays him daily. Dr. Blackwood treats him like a specimen in a jar." Thomas taught himself to read by age 7, devouring every book the sympathetic nurses smuggled into his room. By age 10, he was fluent in Latin and French. By 15, he had read more medical texts than many practicing physicians. Yet he remained a prisoner in his own body, confined to a bed that became both his world and his cage. The cruelest part of Thomas's story was the deliberate isolation. Dr. Blackwood insisted that emotional attachments would compromise his medical observations. Nurses were forbidden from spending extra time with the boy. Visitors were prohibited. Thomas lived in a bubble of enforced loneliness. his only human contact coming during medical examinations. When you think about the children in your life, remember that right now, someone like Thomas might be forgotten in an institution somewhere. If this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply remember the forgotten. As Thomas entered adolescence, his body began failing in new ways. His spine curved so severely that his ribs pressed against his organs. Breathing became a constant struggle. Pain was his daily companion, yet his mind remained sharp, perhaps growing sharper as his body weakened. In his late teens, Thomas began keeping a secret journal. Written on scraps of paper hidden beneath his mattress, these fragments provide the only first-person account of his experience. The journal, discovered decades later, reveals a brilliant mind slowly being crushed by isolation. He wrote in shaky handwriting, "I dream of walking, not just moving my legs, but the feeling of earth beneath my feet. I imagine the sound my shoes would make on cobblestones. I wonder if I would cast a shadow like other people, or if my twisted form would create something monstrous on the ground." Another entry, dated 1908, reads, "Dr. Blackwood measured my spine again today, 23 degrees more curved than last month. He seemed pleased. I wanted to ask him what it feels like to be excited by another person's suffering, but I stayed silent. Silence is my only power here." The most haunting entry came just months before Thomas's death. "I have been thinking about what my mother would say if she could see me now. Would she recognize the baby she held in her dying arms? Would she be proud that I learned to read, or heartbroken that I never learned to live?" Thomas's condition deteriorated rapidly in 1911. His respiratory system, compressed by his increasingly severe spinal deformity, began shutting down. Dr. Blackwood documented every stage of the decline with clinical detachment, noting symptoms and progression rates as if Thomas were a laboratory animal. On October 15, 1912, Thomas Whitman died in the same bed where he had lived for 23 years. He was alone, as he had been for most of his life. His final words, recorded by a night nurse, were, "I wonder what the sky looks like today." Dr. Blackwood's final report on Thomas runs 47 pages. It details every measurement, every progression, every stage of his subject's deterioration. But nowhere in those pages does Blackwood acknowledge that he had studied a human being. The report reads like an autopsy of a specimen, not the death of a person who had loved literature, learned languages, and dreamed of walking in the sun. Thomas was buried in an unmarked grave in Boston's Woodland Cemetery, Section 34, Plot 127. No headstone marked his resting place. No funeral was held. The hospital's records listed him simply as Subject 47, Spina Bifida Study, concluded. But the story doesn't end with Thomas's death. In 1987, during renovation of the old Boston City Hospital, construction workers discovered a sealed room behind Ward 7. Inside, they found boxes of medical records, photographs, and personal effects from the hospital's darkest period. Among these discoveries were Thomas's hidden journal pages and letters from nurses who had cared for him. The revelation sparked outrage. Medical ethics committees launched investigations. Historians began piecing together the full scope of what had happened. Thomas Whitman became a symbol of how medical institutions had once treated vulnerable people as objects rather than human beings. The room also contained something else. Dozens of books with Thomas's name written inside the covers.
These were the books he had read during his imprisonment, volumes on philosophy, history, literature, and science. In the margins, he had written notes and observations that revealed a brilliant mind trapped in circumstances beyond his control. One book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, contained a passage that Thomas had underlined repeatedly. "I celebrate myself and sing myself." In the margin, he had written, "How does one celebrate a self that exists only in thoughts? How does one sing when no one is listening?" Today, Boston Medical Center displays a small plaque in what was once Ward 7. It reads, "In memory of those who suffered here, and in commitment to the dignity of every patient." But few people walking past understand the full horror of what happened in that place. Thomas Whitman lived his entire life as a medical curiosity, never experiencing the basic freedoms we take for granted. He never felt wind on his face, never walked through a forest, never held another person's hand in comfort rather than examination. Yet somehow, through pure force of will and intellectual hunger, he became more fully human than the doctors who studied him. His story raises uncomfortable questions that echo through modern medicine. When does treatment become exploitation? How do we balance scientific advancement with human dignity? What do we owe to those who cannot advocate for themselves? These questions matter today because vulnerable people still exist in our hospitals, our care facilities, our institutions. They depend on us to remember that behind every medical case is a human being with hopes, dreams, and the fundamental right to dignity. Thomas Whitman's tragedy was not just his physical condition. It was that he lived and died forgotten, treated as an object of study rather than a person deserving of love and respect. His greatest suffering was not physical pain, but the crushing loneliness of being unseen as a human being. As you go about your day, remember Thomas. Remember that in institutions around the world, there may be people living forgotten lives, depending on the kindness of strangers and the conscience of caregivers. The purpose of sharing Thomas's story is not to horrify, but to honor his memory and ensure that the lessons learned from his suffering guide us towards a more compassionate future. Every person, regardless of their condition or circumstances, deserves to be seen, remembered, and treated with dignity. In the end, Thomas Whitman achieved something his captors never expected. Through his hidden journal and the courage of nurses who preserved his story, he transcended his physical prison. His words survived when his body could not. His humanity shines through despite every attempt to reduce him to a medical specimen. And now, more than a century later, we remember him not as Subject 47, but as Thomas, a boy who dreamed of walking, who loved learning, and who refused to let his spirit be broken even when his body failed him. What haunts me most about Thomas's story is not just what was done to him, but how easily he was forgotten. How many other Thomas Whitmans are there in history? People whose suffering was hidden behind institutional walls. If you found this story as haunting as I did, I need you to do something important. Don't let Thomas be forgotten again. Share this video with someone who cares about medical ethics, human rights, or simply believes that every person's story matters. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one, because the moment we stop remembering the forgotten, history becomes free to repeat its darkest chapters. And here's what I want to know from you. What questions does Thomas's story raise about how we treat vulnerable people today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter. They're how we ensure that stories like Thomas's lead to change, not just sadness. The next time you walk past a hospital, a care facility, or any institution designed to help people, remember Thomas Whitman. Remember that behind every window, every door, every medical record, there is a human being deserving of dignity, respect, and the simple acknowledgement that their life has meaning.